Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our meeting today. We have an invited speaker today at AI2. Malcolm is the group leader of the Center of Robotics and Biosystems at Northwestern University, and he has joint appointments between mechanical engineering, biomedical engineering, and Department of Neurobiology, which I find fascinating. His work focuses on extracting principles of underlying animal behavior, focusing on interactions between biomechanics, neural processing, and evolution and sensory systems. And he incorporates these principles into advanced biorobotic systems or large-scale simulations on computing clusters. He has received great awards for his work. In 2009, he won the Presidential Early Career Award for Science and Engineering from President Obama at the White House. So that said, I will leave the space to Malcolm for his talk. We're very excited to hear it.
All right. Thank you very much, Kiana. It's a pleasure to have a chance to tell you about our work. The title is Sensory and Ecological Basis of Plan-Based Action Selection. After I read your mission statement, which I didn't do until after I sent this title off, I decided I buried the lead a little bit, so I'm going to step toward something maybe a little bit closer to something that might fit with your goals. Not too obviously yet, but let's see. How do we fix our tendency to not care about things far away in time or space? So that's what kind of underlies this realm of work. So I don't want to bury the lead in terms of the motivation. And since I'm being sort of transparent in the realm of motivation, I want to show you this slide, which is a picture of my 8-year-old daughter from a few days ago. You know, when one thing that I don't know about you, but one thing that I hope continues after the end of the pandemic is, you know, how we've all become a bit more transparent about our role as both care receivers and care givers, those of us who have families. And I hope that continues. And in this case, there's some direct relevance to the work in that when we had her, I had some concern for leaving the planet in a more sustainable place, just like I think everybody with a conscience would. But after we had her, I suddenly started asking myself pretty adamantly what I could do, one small thing I could do in terms of science to maybe lean towards or push towards something sustainable. And the way I thought about it was, you know, we are aerobic life forms, and those arose around 3 billion years ago. And it's funny because we arose when the metabolic byproduct of cyanobacteria, which is oxygen, killed the life forms that were previous, which are anaerobic life forms. And so, you know, obviously a looming question is, how do we avoid the metabolic byproducts of carbon-intensive humans repeating this cycle, right? But there's a problem stepping towards what I'm going to talk to you today about, and that is mammals are bad at decisions with long temporal horizons, such as those exceeding their life expectancy. So I decided, well, maybe I'll try 2 different tracks. One, a short fuse track, I think of it, and that is motivated by the question, can we devise a socio-technical system that lets us plan better over longer time horizons? And a long fuse track, which is, can we understand what makes long-range planning hard in the brain well enough to intervene to make it easier? So some sort of cognitive prosthesis. So for the short fuse stuff, I'm just going to give you one slide on that because I think it's kind of fun. It's just recently starting to bear fruit. So the problem there is that there is no short-term, as in lifetime, cost to us as individuals holding a false belief about a distant looming threat, no matter how massive its impact. I mean, we're faced with one that could end life on Earth, right? But is it really motivating people to change behavior, or politicians or societies? It's not looking too great. Well, what if we devise a prediction market where you win or lose money based on predictions you place on correlates of that threat that manifest at shorter time scales? So we did this with some collaborators shown here. So we devised a prediction market. We set up this very complicated market online with all these transaction ledgers and all the rest for people to predict on climate events. So it would be things like global warming. In the global warming area, will the global warming index reach a certain value by a certain date according to this source? The contract expires on this date, blah, blah, blah. So half the people in the study were climate skeptics, half were believers, then divided in half again to do a control group and a treatment group, and only the treatment group actually did the prediction market. And what we found, kind of excitingly, because many interventions have been tried and they work well on climate believers as in increasing their concern, but it has zero impact on climate skeptics. But what we found is that climate skeptics changed their belief proportionate to their winnings, and they tended to win with predictions in alignment with climate science. Okay, so that's kind of exciting, and it's under revision for Nature Climate Change right now. But getting toward what I'm going to tell you today about the long fuse track, can we understand what makes long-range planning hard in the brain well enough to intervene to make it easier? Well, the problem here is we understand very little about why we evolved the capacity to plan at all, let alone intervene with it in the brain. And, you know, it's only certain people, I'm one of them, who thinks that one ought to know something about why we would come up with this capacity before we try to crack it. That's a particular intellectual style. It happens to be mine. Since the most notable examples of brains planning are all terrestrial animals, or formerly terrestrial like dolphins, can evolution offer clues about mechanism, right? So that's how we started. There we go. So take a look at this. So as a sensory motor specialist working on fish for most of my career, I looked a lot at the range of different sensory systems. The one I worked on a lot is electrosense, which is a weird one, but this is about vision. And this is visual range for a 30-centimeter black disk through water and through air. Okay, and let's just focus on this middle realm here, which is an eye size. It's close to your own eye size. You can see roughly 800, that black disk roughly 800 meters away in daylight, and 7.5 meters in water of typical turbidity, that's murkiness, that you'd find around the edge of a coastline or the edge of a lake. In super clear water, like so clear it's extremely rare to find on the planet, that range goes up to 50 meters or so. But look at this, through coastal water, your eye size, look at how the range changes through the coastal water with the coastal water distance, 7.2, 7.5, 7.7, almost no difference with respect to eye size. In other words, you're range limited by your medium when you're viewing things through water. But you're not when you're viewing things through air. You have this range here with a 10 millimeter eye, and as you get to a 30 millimeter eye, you've got quite a bit more range. And when I came across this fact pattern, I immediately started thinking about, well, so that should mean that paleobiologists have noticed that eye orbit size, which is something you can look at in the fossil record, eye orbit size is proportional to eye size, that should have increased significantly after animals came up on land, which was 380 million years ago. So I went looking for the paper, and there was no paper. And yet, the fossils were all published, you know, and the fossils are pretty clear. Here's some of them. So here's a fully aquatic animal. Here's a transitional animal, and this is basically in proportion to terrestriality. The orbit size was indeed getting bigger. So that was kind of exciting that there was a prediction and nobody seemed to notice or care about this. So we did all kinds of analysis of it and did some simulations of viewing distances and so on and so forth. And we were able to actually show something quite interesting, which was that eye size increased before animals came up on land, which kind of breaks our hypothesis. And when I first came across the pattern, I went, oh, this is terrible. I'm totally wrong. But what it actually led us to believe, and has subsequently been more and more corroborated by other work, is that these transitional animals were actually crocodile-like animals that were surfacing their eyeballs above the water to look at prey on land. And you go, well, this is before vertebrates arrived on land, so what the heck are they looking at? Well, it turns out invertebrates were on land before vertebrates. So they had lots of undefended food up on the banks. And so we imagine that they were hunting those things. And Neil Shubin just published a really exciting paper about Tiktaalik, one of these transitional animals, that shows that their jaw mechanics and the way they ate is consistent with a biting style that only land animals typically use. Also some aquatic marginal cases, but it's much more of a jaw style that is used for biting, which is characterized, which is what land animals do. So there's more and more evidence suggesting that this was in fact the case. These are animals that were transitional. So in other words, what's exciting about this is that you would think that the important limb, the important body part for getting up on the land might be the arm or the leg or whatever. But it turns out it might be the eyeball. That it was vision that dragged us onto land, not limbs. And vision got us enough reward that we eventually evolved limbs to get to the things that we like to eat. So I went through that. So now we're up on land, putting that sort of aside now. We're up on land. We can think about a spectrum of behavioral control, which has some resonances with what I just told you. So there's a reactive mode, which is simple and rapid transformations of sensory input. And here's somebody driving, sees a deer, and goes off the road. We've all been there in one way or another, hopefully not quite so dramatically. And on the other side is sort of this extended prey capture sequence of this animal, this cat, big cat hunting a gazelle. And it's using the habitat in a very clever way for this long, slow, deliberative stalking approach. So we have these two ends of the spectrum, one end being rapid and the other being more slow. So a possible implication then of long-range vision is the possibility of complex decision-making over the extended sensory range. And we had premonitions of this direction, pretty significant premonitions, when we did the paleobiology work on eye size. And I was really, I had an awesome time sort of collaborating with some filmmakers to do a short film about the paleo work, where we sort of went out on a limb a little bit as to what we might find out in the future regarding this pattern. And so this was from 4 years ago, and I'll show you a few minutes of that movie. It's called Our Short-Sighted Inner Fish, and I have to switch over to a tab to show this. So 1 second, and I'm going to shift to a different tab. Okay.
Almost 400 million years ago, some adventurous fish made a huge leap that eventually led to the evolution of humankind. They decided to come up on land. We humans probably would never have evolved the intelligence we have today if not for that move onto land. Why? Because it vastly improved our eyesight. According to neuroscientist MacIver, The way we think about the world is closely tied to what we can see. And fish can't see a whole heck of a lot. That's mainly because light doesn't travel very far in water. Our ancient fish ancestors lived their lives in a constant fog, so their brains evolved to react quickly to whatever suddenly appeared on the horizon. MacIver had a theory that the move to land expanded our aquatic ancestors' vision, and in turn, their brains. To test his theory, he and paleontologist Lars Schmitz spent a year running simulations with fossil data. Their research revealed new clues about why fish came onto land in the first place. It all seems to have started when the first fish peeked above the water's surface. Suddenly it was able to see 70 times further, and behold, a smorgasbord of tasty land dwellers. To capitalize on this discovery, the fish would have to evolve. Its eyes soon moved to the top of its head and tripled in size, and its fins began evolving into limbs so that it could stalk its new prey like a crocodile. Hunting on land was a mental game changer for the early tetrapods. Their total sensory volume increased 1,000,000-fold, giving them a much bigger window into the future. The first animal that figured out how to plan accordingly instead of just reacting would have had a huge evolutionary advantage. Iterate that kind of natural selection 1,000,000 times, and eventually we have something called prospective cognition. That's our ability to weigh different options for the future and choose strategically. To this day, fish have not evolved those kinds of complex planning skills, but many land animals have. Understanding the evolutionary roots of intelligence helps explain how humans got so smart, but also why we are so dumb. We've evolved to deal with the things we can see in the here and now. We still don't plan well for things that are too far away in time or space. Will our vision ever evolve so that we can see the faraway consequences of our actions more clearly? Evolution won't make that happen anytime soon. But understanding the relationship between vision and planning may help us engineer solutions, like using technology to bring faraway things closer. That just might give us the evolutionary advantage we need to survive the next 400 million years.
So that gives you an idea of the sort of vision of where we might go with the work if we could only show that this is true, that there's some relationship, in other words, between planning and extended sensory range and what we were able to garner by being on land. And to my knowledge, up to the point where we started, nobody had actually tried to do scientific work on why there was a selective benefit for animals to plan in the first place. So that's where we were 4 years ago. And the idea then is just to sort of expand upon that point.
Quick question.
Yeah.
So love the video, by the way. But
Thank you.
I was wondering, it's hard for humans to look at the future or visualize the future or the effects of their actions.
Yes.
But at least for the past few decades, we've had a lot of sort of retrospective, we can see how things have changed from the 80s to the 90s to the 2000s based on actions in the 80s and 70s and 60s.
Right.
Is this going to be a factor, in your opinion, in changing the way we act on this earth?
Right. No, I think it could be. So that's exactly this point that my alternate title of, what can we do to fix our tendency not to care about things that are off in time or place? And there are two different ways we might come to not care that much. One We simply don't know, right? But that can't be the case for climate change. We've known for decades. The models, the first model that predicted this problem are 50 years old, and they basically have been correct to the degree Celsius. So it's not a lack of information or knowledge. It's a lack of care for something distant in time and space. And so that's where I want to focus effort in the future in terms of engineered devices, and eventually, like on the long fuse approach, maybe a cognitive prosthesis to change the way we process distant in time or space rewards. So, but to expand on that little part in the video where we sort of talk about your sensory volume expanded a million times, here's a typical underwater aquatic scene. Okay, so here's a barracuda or whatever it is, a few meters away, and there's basically nothing else. If there are obstacles in the space, you can't see them, or they're too far away, and they might not be very far away at all, because vision only works a few meters out into space before everything is blurry. Whereas, and so the nervous system in that situation, here's a prey. You're going through space. You have a sensing domain, and you have a domain that you're immediately moving into, and those are basically equal spaces. And you hit a predator, and then there's these cells dedicated in the brain called Modner cells that fire off escape sequences in 5 milliseconds or so, and hopefully you get away. On land, there's an entirely different situation, and you see things a lot further away. And now there's the possibility of seeing several different possible futures, and they differ in their value, because one goes through a pond and might make a lot of sound that might alert the predator. This one comes too close to the predator. So you pick the one that has the highest likelihood of a good reward, right? So how do we refine this picture, though, into specific testable claims? That's the problem. There's no way to observe the emergence or elaboration of planning circuits with terrestriality, because that happened 300 million years ago, maybe a little bit more recently. But in any case, it's soft tissue. It doesn't fossilize. So how do we test things? So computational modeling of a predator-prey interaction is where we went, because it's one of the most important drivers of change in nervous systems, is how you do in your predator-prey interactions. And we did this by manipulating sensory range, habit, or plan-based action selection as two different possible ways of controlling behavior, planning capacity, and environmental complexity. So that's the space of things we tweaked in a computational simulation. And our hypothesis is that in dynamic environments that model aquatic and terrestrial habitats, planning confers a selective advantage proportional to visual range and spatial complexity. So since ancestral habitats are simple and only afford visual range is on the order of 1 to 2 body lengths, if our hypothesis is correct, then planning was significantly less advantageous in aquatic habitats. And so a very basic point to make here, just remind us what habit versus plan-based or model-free versus model-based action control means. Imagine you have an animal and it has 3 paths to a goal. Under habit-based action selection, the agent learns the relative values of taking an action at a given state. So it learns, if I go left, I get a reward value of 20, say. If I go forward, I get a reward value of 30. And if I go right, I get a reward value of 10, just for example. So, and this is, by the way, these are just associations: left 20, forward 30, right 10. No map is involved here. You're just thinking about action, reward. So action or state values are divorced from their outcome, and we have inflexible automatic responses. Under plan-based action selection, or model-based, the agent forward simulates the consequences of taking actions. Okay, so you have literally a map in the head, sometimes called a cognitive map, relies on action outcome knowledge structure to give you flexible responses. And so let's see how these two do in a couple of situations here. So here's a situation, we have a block now to one of the paths. And let's suppose you're using habit-based action control. So you've learned your rewards versus actions. You go forward and you remember, well, if I go left, I can get 20. So I'll go left. Oh, shoot. And then you remember, if I go right, I'll get 10. So you do the right one. Now, if you use model-based control, you go forward, but now you remember path 2 and path 1 have the same terminus, so you better take path 3. That is the essence of model-based control. So, so we did computational modeling of some different environments, well, 2 in particular, pseudo-aquatic environment. We call it pseudo because this is just grid world, 2D, lots of idealizations. And in an environment with no clutter, we varied visual range, behavioral control strategy, and how many states the prey could forward simulate. And so here's the setup. Here's the grid world. We have a predator, we have a prey, and we have a visual cone. And here's where the prey has to get, okay? There's a bunch of rules in this world. I think for the sake of time, I'll just tell you, we varied visual range. I've told you that. It can move in all directions. The predator was 1.5 times faster. That's ecologically in the correct range. And the predator cannot plan. And that wasn't an ecologically rooted decision. That was a decision born of the fact that if you have a POMDP interacting with another POMDP, you rapidly run out of compute cycles, pretty much regardless of what your computational engine is. So we were restricted to looking at model sort of a reactive controller on one of the agents. We chose the predator. We're pretty sure the results that I'm going to tell you about are insensitive to the choice of whether it's the predator or the prey who gets to do the planning. It's just that we are restricted to doing. With our current algorithm, we have some new algorithms that we're excited about. But with our algorithm as of a few years ago, we were restricted to doing model-based control in only one of the agents and reactive control in the other.
Sorry, quick question.
Yeah.
So regarding the length of forward simulation, is it a function of like memory capacity, or is it a function of the range of vision? So what does it depend on?
It was an independent knob that we twiddled, but it, absolutely true. So we twiddled it from 0 to 5,000 states forward simulated. And then you could ask me some awkward questions about like, well, how does that relate to the memory capacity of vertebrates? And I would say, well, I don't really know. And maybe we chunk it up and I bob and weave in various other ways. So just consider this as an unanswered question. But yes, it's a good thing to think about. We didn't, and you'll see we varied it. Well, you'll see how we varied it. And in pseudo-terrestrial environments with prey that can view the entire environment except where blocked by occlusions, we varied the environmental clutter, quantified by entropy, the prey behavioral control, and how many states the prey could forward simulate. And so here's what it looks like in terms of one habitat, and here is a ray, visual ray. It's blocked by an occlusion, yeah. Okay. So a habit-based action selection system is essentially what we did is we took an environment. Here's an open environment, one with no obstacles, and we looked at all the possible success paths, or not all the possible ones, at least many that we computed. And then we took that as our seed set of success trajectories. And then we'd actually run simulations where we'd have the predator doing its thing with randomness, and we'd see, is that particular path randomly chosen successful? If it is, then we upweight its probability of being selected on the next round, and we go through it again. And we do this a whole bunch of times and say, on the next one, say it chooses a path where here's -R indicating death, so that gets deweighted. And you go on like this. Eventually you get a policy library, but the important thing is that you pick one weighted by success rate in that particular environment, and then you do it to the end. You're not updating your path as a function of time, dependent on what the predator is doing. It is a habit. That is the essence of model-free control. It is a habit. It unfurls without intervention after unfurling. So with plan-based action selection, what we do is essentially we have a tree of possibilities, and we go down in imagination down the tree, and we explore different possibilities, and we back propagate up the value at the terminal nodes. And then the number of forward states simulated, here it's 10, here it's 100. We went between 10 and 5,000. So that gives you a sense of how deeply we would go. Of course, it might not be deep, it might be shallow, depending on how many branches you do. And that all depends on how that particular tree evolves as a function of your virtual actions and rewards that come back. And the algorithm we use is partially observable Monte Carlo planning by Silver, 2010. We actually, Herman, who's on the meeting as well, he recently did a survey of algorithms for online planning versus offline learning and hybrid approaches, and they seem to all be variations of Silver's POMDP. So perhaps a classic choice there. So performance in civil habitats while varying visual range. What we found was, so as we vary the visual range up, and the number of forward states simulated goes up, our survival rate goes up. Not too surprising. Kind of expected that. So here's a couple of animations. Here's visual range 1, short and brutish lives. And here's visual range 5, both in the pseudo-aquatic open condition. Okay. And we often find that the paths are thigmotactic, meaning that they go to the walls. And this was interesting to us because animals, especially animals under anxiety, will run to the edges of a space, be they walls of a lab or outside along edges of habitat structures to avoid predation. And it's called thigmotaxis. It's been known for decades and decades and decades. And our simulation sort of that emerged out of the simulations.
So quick question, you didn't have any obstacles or occlusions in these scenarios?
Right. Yeah, so this is just meant to simulate the open water condition. You've got no obstacles in view. Yeah, exactly. So we did a heat map, and you can just see the thigmotaxis here. And we can show that habit-based action planning, which is in the red line here, is not significantly different from planning at 5,000 states forward simulated, which is as far as we explored for computational reasons.
I also have a question.
Yeah.
Do you think it's reasonable? So you said that the predator moves a little randomly. Is it reasonable for the prey to be able to plan, but not the predator?
Well, in the real world, if you have a mammal on mammal, they might both be planning. If you have a mammal on insect, you've got a predator who plans and a prey who probably doesn't. So it all depends on the particular behavioral dynamic. We have a constraint, which is 2 POMDPs interacting equals you don't finish computing. So go ahead. So that is a constraint under which we operated, and we decided we'll pick the prey. We could have picked the predator, but as I said, we have algorithms now where we think we might be able to do planning in both agents. We'll see. I can't say for sure yet. Okay, so plan-based action selection, while advantage in proportion to visual range, can't improve performance over habit-based action selection in these simple environments. So we're going to now introduce clutter, because that is the characteristic thing of terrestrial habitats. You get a visual range, and you get all these geological features and plants and knolls and boulders and all this stuff. And we know that goes back right to the Devonian. All that stuff goes back to the Devonian when we emerged up on the land. And so we used entropy as a convenient measure for clutter. Don't think of entropy in an information theoretic sense. It's just being used as a measure of clutter here. And we then can generate randomly different worlds at a fixed entropy level and test those randomly generated worlds to see what kind of survival rate our prey has in them as a function of entropy. And by the way, there is a cool online game you can try that Herman and Alex in the lab generated for our publication, where you get to try these different habitats out as prey and try to survive in them. And it gets pretty challenging, especially in the mid-entropy environments. So you might have fun with that. Here's some stuff about how we can think of the space with occlusions as a graph structure, and we can actually get at why it is mid-entropy levels that maximize planning success. And it has to do with the fact that the network complexity, where we call the network essentially a visibility network, and that means, for example, all the cells are nodes of a graph, and the edges are, for a particular node, what other nodes you can see from that node. So that visibility network lets us then compute a complexity measure on that network, and that peaks at mid-entropy levels. So right about here, here's the network degree complexity, peaking at around 0.5. And what we found really cool is that this is number of forward states simulated 100, 1,000, and 5,000 at different entropy levels and survival rate of our prey. We found that at 5,000, that at mid-entropy levels, we get a big benefit of planning, but at lower entropy levels and really high entropy levels, in other words, low complexity spaces, we don't get a significant difference between planning and habit. So that's here, for example, and here's an interaction. You can see it's essentially like the aquatic case. You've got very, very few obstacles to work with at low entropy, and the heat maps sort of disclose that the behaviors are pretty stereotypical, thigmotactic again. And at high entropy, well, now it's just really cluttered, and whether or not you run into the predator is kind of a function of where you spawned in our hands, at least. And it's kind of random, and planning doesn't advantage you that much. And the heat map sort of discloses again a stereotypical pattern, not now along the edges, it's just along the path that gets you to the goal. In the mid-range, though, things get really interesting, which is that, take a look at this one. So I'll let you look at it once, and then we'll run it again. So the prey uses this obstacle to dwell for a while before shooting out the side and going to the goal. So it's hiding. It's essentially using the obstacle as a tool. So that emerged. Things like this emerge at mid-entropy. They don't emerge at low and high entropy. So complex behaviors that strategically deploy occlusions emerge. The prey survival strategy becomes less stereotyped. And so here's what we get in the end: survival rate with planning at 5,000 versus habit success rate in these different worlds. And there's a big dip here. So it's kind of the inverse of the planning bump, okay? And we've got a lot of, there's a lot to be said about that, sorry. Emergent strategies for survival are dependent on environmental properties interacting with dynamic contingencies. Now, with habit-based selection, you are not sensitive to changes in contingencies at runtime. You are in an evolutionary sense. If there's structures in the environment that tend to give you higher success rates over time, that will build into the habit controller, but it can't take care of rapidly changing dynamic constraints That's just the nature of model-free control. Whereas complex environments, which favor visual tracking, generate flexible behaviors. And these allow for plan-based action selection to utilize clutter as a tool to increase performance from stereotypical action sequences. And so here's a typical habit selection situation where it picks one of the success trajectories, but because, you know, maybe the predator does one different move from what was successful when the habit was created, the timing is a little bit off with the occlusion and it ends up dying. Okay, let me go to this. So one thing we're really curious about is what happens if we use mid-entropy environments, but we shorten visual range? In other words, how much is dependent on the structure of the world being this patchy thing that lets you leverage occlusions, and how much is it dependent on visual range? And what we found is that when the prey visual range is restricted in environments that have the greatest path diversity, so that's just a way of cutting down, rather than simulate across all the worlds we tested, we just simulated the ones that have the highest path diversity. We found that performance was significantly degraded. So still planning, everything else the same, but you now have short visual range. So higher planning levels still results in higher survival rates. It's just that performance is not significantly different from habit-based action selection, which was a bit of a surprise to us. But essentially says that if you put blinders on an animal that would otherwise be able to plan using its visual spatial memory and hippocampus and various other things, you can make it essentially survive no better than a habit-based system in spaces that otherwise would give you big benefits to planning. So, oh yeah, this is a bit more. So here's an example of a short range, an animal with short range working in an entropy, in an environment that otherwise would give a good benefit to planning. And I'll just skip over this in the, okay, so a couple last slides before I end. One is, how does grid world entropy relate to real habitats? You know, it's a bit of a mismatch, right? So turns out there's a measure that's sort of related to fractal dimension. Those of you who know what fractal dimension is, it's related to that, but it's a multi-scale version of fractal dimension, and it's called lacunarity. And landscape ecologists have used it in the past to measure the complexity of landscapes and seascapes as well. So this is we had a lot of data to go on. It turns out lacunarity has been plotted for a lot of different environments. And so we asked how our environments relate to what the lacunarity of our different environments as a function of entropy was. And here's what we found. Okay, so high entropy environments are low lacunarity and low entropy environments are high lacunarity. But now we can plot over these ranges what different habitats are. So this is coastal water range here. This is land range, and this is structured aquatic range. And we can look at survival rate through this lens now. So on land, planning versus habit has a huge benefit. There's a huge payoff. And here's an example of a patchy habitat in that range. After looking up some papers, I found the Okavango Delta. It happens to be a good lacunarity in the lacunarity sweet spot. And that, by the way, is thought to be a modern analog of where humans emerged after coming down from the trees and separating from chimpanzees. And for coastal and for structured aquatic, there's no significant difference between the survival rate with planning versus habit. So this is a fascinating clue to what might have primed the selection for circuitry for planning. You know, this is a very challenging environment from the standpoint of a prey, because you're really exposed when you come out of this environment. But it's also, you know, prey can be us, or it can be the thing we want to eat. And the thing we want to eat might be big herbivores who want to go out onto that grassland, right? So, so it has pluses and minuses, but we're fascinated by the possibility that this might give us a clue as to why archaeological evidence indicates that this is the kind of habitat we invaded after leaving the trees, and it's all connected with the emergence of bipedalism and all that stuff too, which is further interesting. But we can't go into it right now. So some take-homes. So we evolved from an aquatic habitat favoring short-range interactions with nervous systems that were dialed in accordingly. Short-range favors model-free habit control. Life on land permits vision and other senses to have long range, and we show that longer range sensing plus the right realm of habitat lacunarity confers high selective benefit to model-based planning control. Yet, mammals and birds plan in real time, while the best contemporary planning algorithms, POMDP invariants, suffer computational challenges with naturalistic levels of environmental complexity. So what can we do to achieve real-time planning? And so that's an area we're pushing hard on. And we're also pushing hard on the topic of how does the brain do it? So right now we've built a habitat that's reconfigurable with magnetic obstacles shown here. We have a fox predator on a robot that we're doing. That was the first draft. We're doing lots of modifications of it. Here's a mouse. The mouse is water restricted. It goes from the start chamber to the end chamber, and it tries to get the water reward at the end chamber, and then it comes back along this route, this return chute. Okay, and the idea is that possibly with the right lacunarity of reconfigurable habitat, we can, as we modify the lacunarity, we can show that the animal does more or less planning to avoid the foxy predator to get to the water reward. All right, so this is an example of that from just a couple weeks ago. Some of the very first data. Here's Foxy doing its thing and scaring the daylights, I guess, maybe out of the mouse. Hopefully not the daylights out, but definitely giving it pause and making it go back to the beginning and reroute. Okay, and so we'll see if we'll see if this approach manages to give us insight into what is going on with the animal as we challenge it differently with different habitat complexity. Okay, so the student who did much of the work here is Orjan Mugan, who's now a postdoc in the David Reddish lab, and we have two newer students who are doing new and exciting work building on that work. Is Herman Espinoza on the call as well, and Alex, who I'm not sure if he's with us or not. And then some collaborators in the climate stuff is Moran Cerf and Sandra. And the neuro stuff is with Dan Dombeck, and the paleobiology and the paleontology is with Lars Schmitz. Okay, and I'll leave you with that quote, and I'm happy to take any questions in the remaining minutes. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. This was a very interesting talk. I personally really enjoyed it. So do we have any questions for Malcolm?
Yeah, I have a few questions. Yeah, very, very interesting talk. So regarding the last part of your talk, so there are some information encoded in the genes, and when you change the natural habitat of the animal, does it perform the same, or does it affect the behavior at all?
We don't know yet. That video is literally one of the first we've taken. It was only a couple weeks ago, and we decided we got to rebuild the robot because it isn't agile enough, and blah 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 blah. And so we're doing lots of stuff right now to rejigger the system. And we also have a concern that using inbred mice, which is a typical model system in neuroscience, might not be appropriate. So we have some wild. They're called Permiscus, which are about to start water scheduling, and another type, a grasshopper mouse, which is the saber-toothed tiger of the rodent world. They will tear up other mammals in their space, and they howl at night, and they're just crazy, crazy animals. But those animals are true carnivores, and we suspect that you know, we might need to use a model system like that to see planning emerge in our hands. But we'll see. So early days with inbred mice.
Another question. So at some point you talked about spatial complexity and
yeah.
these things. Is there, I mean, do you have any metric to quantify that? I mean, to measure like this environment is complex, this environment is not.
Yeah, so it's in the paper, in the Nature Communications paper from last year. In the supplement, we go into the details of it, but it's not our work. It's network complexity. So you can turn at least a discretized space into a graph, and then look at a visibility network. So we're talking about visually guided behavior here. So we turn it into a visibility network, and then we can compute the network complexity of that graph.
Yeah.
So we think that might relate to what the animal thinks is a complex space. Of course, I don't know for sure.
Thanks.
Yep.
Do we have any other questions?
I was curious. I worked with some vision scientists. Did you use, for the modeling, vision modeling, did you use iSet Bio at all?
No, I've never heard of iSet Bio. What's that?
So I'm a librarian, so I can't really articulate what it is, but it's, what do they say?
So the way we did it was we looked at equations relating to photon currents and photoreceptors, and we're basically looking at when is the current sufficiently over the background noise level, which has been really well characterized in photoreceptors, to actually cause a detection event for that black disk in space. So it's not really even an image forming question. It's not like we're not like simulating a visual image. We're just trying to, in a very physiologically rooted way, estimate what is a detection event of a high contrast object off in space, where that space can be filled by air or it can be filled by water. And that water, for the water, we had to go to a person who spends his entire career doing mathematical modeling of the optics of light and water. Turns out to be a whole thing, and he has a company that makes software for simulating. It's really important for remote sensing applications and stuff like that. Anyway, he did the simulations of the light through water part of the work, which is its own modeling enterprise. We did the calculations of the receptor currents and so on and so forth. But so it's a really low level, as in close to the hardware, I guess, model of vision, not one you could use, say, to look at image formation.
Okay, great. Oh, sure, go ahead.
Sorry, thank you. I have a quick question. What are your thoughts on the ethics of using live prey in your experiments?
So in terms of what now?
I don't know, just you had mentioned scaring the daylight out of the mouse. What are your thoughts on the effects that could have on mice that you're using on other living prey, and how could you potentially mitigate the effect that it has on mice in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's a stress, right? It's definitely a stress. I would say it's considerably less than, say, foot shocks, which are another aversive stimuli. But it is something we're concerned about. I see what you're saying. Yeah, so are we concerned with the ethical dimension of this? So it's a stress. It needs to be somewhat aversive. We don't want to make it so aversive that it's, debilitating the animal. But our problem actually is more that it turns out the animal starts to quickly figure out this is not a real threat to me. And, once it figures out there's no threat, it's going to do absolutely zero to engage planning circuits to try to get to the reward without intersecting the predator. So there's a line there that we're trying to find between scared enough that it engages strategic thinking, but not so scared that it's stressed, and not so unscared that it just goes straight for the ward. And that is a line that we're very interested in carefully finding. Right now, all evidence points toward the animal quickly not being scared of the robot. So we need to start thinking of, how do we indicate to the animal that it is a real threat, while not actually carrying out that threat, because we don't want to hurt the animal, for this research. We just want to make it worry.
Very
That's a good question.
It's very interesting that you go both on simulation and also on real animals. I find that part very fascinating. Anyway, thank you so much, Malcolm, for accepting our invite. This was a fascinating talk. We all really enjoyed it, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Yay.